March 23, 1943. The high plateau east of El Guettar, Tunisia. General Fritz von Broich of the German 10th Panzer Division sat in his command car, listening to the sound of his tanks rolling into position. 50 serviceable panzers, 6,000 men, a company of tank destroyers, an assault gun battery. The terrain was open, the pre-dawn air was cold and still, and von Broich had every reason to believe the next few hours would be a rout, because he had done this before. 5 weeks earlier, in February, German forces had torn through American positions in a series of battles that culminated at the Kasserine Pass. They destroyed 183 American tanks. They captured over 3,000 American soldiers. They inflicted 6,000 casualties on a force that, in von Broich's view, had run at almost every turn. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel described the Americans as inexperienced amateurs. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring expected the North African campaign to end with Tunis in German hands. Senior British officers, including Montgomery and Alexander, privately concluded the Americans were hopelessly trained and led. British soldiers in the line had even taken to calling them our Italians. Now at El Guettar, von Broich was looking across open ground at the exact same American unit he had shattered 5 weeks earlier, the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, Terry Allen's men. He expected the same result. What he got was something else entirely. By 10 a.m, von Broich's tanks had run into a minefield that hadn't been there 5 weeks prior. As his panzers slowed to clear the field, they were hit by carefully positioned anti-tank guns. American M10 tank destroyers from the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion engaged them from concealed positions his reconnaissance had completely missed. American artillery dropped concentrated, coordinated fire on his armour with a precision his scouts had not detected. Within 1 hour, 30 of his 50 tanks were burning in the open. By midday, the 10th Panzer Division was retreating from a valley it had expected to own by lunch. Von Broich did not understand what had happened. Captured documents confirmed it was the same division, the same numbered regiments, many of the same officers, but they were not the same army. This would happen again in Sicily, in Italy, in Normandy, in the Ardennes. The pattern became so common that German officers in post-war interrogations returned to a single word to describe it: unfassbar, incomprehensible. They had beaten an American unit 1 week and faced what they swore was a different army the next. They could not understand where that speed of adaptation came from. They could not locate the source of it. And despite every attempt, they could not replicate it. What Fritz von Broich witnessed that morning, not luck. It was the first visible result of a system that had been quietly built inside the United States Army over the previous 15 years. A system the Germans didn't know existed. A system that, when it reached full speed in 1944, would turn American infantry divisions into the fastest learning fighting organizations in modern military history. For most of the 20th century, if you asked any serious student of war which army was the best at tactics, you got the same answer. Not the Americans, not the British, the Germans. Since the wars of Prussian unification in the 1860s, the German army had refined a tradition of tactical excellence that every other modern military studied. They pioneered Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, which gave subordinate commanders the authority to adapt their methods to achieve the commander's intent without waiting for orders. They had the best non-commissioned officer corps in the world. Their field regulations were translated and studied at West Point, Sandhurst, and St. Cyr. Between 1939 and 1941, the Wehrmacht had defeated Poland in 5 weeks, France in 6, and the Balkans in under a month. The United States Army, by contrast, was barely an army at all. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the US Army numbered fewer than 200,000 men. It ranked 17th in the world, below Portugal. Its infantry was still drilled with World War I equipment. Its doctrine was built around trench warfare. Its armour doctrine assumed tanks would never fight other tanks. When General George C. Marshall took over as Chief of Staff in September 1939, he inherited a force that European officers privately considered a joke. In 1941, the Army ran the largest peacetime maneuvers in its history, the Louisiana Maneuvers. Nearly 500,000 men. It was a disaster. Combined arms coordination failed at every level. Tank units lost contact with infantry. Artillery fell out of range. Radio discipline broke down. The maneuvers did not prove the US Army was ready for war. They proved the opposite. And yet, something happened during those maneuvers that would matter more than anyone realized. Marshall watched. So did his key subordinates. And what they took away from Louisiana was not a set of tactical lessons. It was a conclusion about process. The US Army could not afford to train the way European armies trained. It did not have a century of tactical tradition. What it could build, what it had to build, was a mechanism for learning faster than anyone else. A system that would take the lessons of one unit in one battle and feed them into every other unit before the next battle. In November 1942, that idea faced its first real test, Operation Torch, the landings in North Africa. The early results were everything the Germans expected. American armour was dispersed. Anti-tank doctrine was a failure. Infantry and tanks rarely worked together. And at the top of the American command sat Major General Lloyd Fredendall, a man who issued orders in a personal slang his own subordinates couldn't decipher. On February 14, 1943, at Sidi Bouzid, the Germans attacked. The US 1st Armored Division was sent in piecemeal and destroyed. The Americans lost 160 tanks in a single day. By February 22nd, at the Kasserine Pass, American positions had collapsed. They lost more ground in a single week than they would lose in any week of the entire war, including the Battle of the Bulge. Rommel assessed the situation and concluded the Americans had not yet learned their lessons. The British agreed, the Germans agreed. Their historical experience told them that Green armies recovered slowly, if at all. The British took 3 years of defeat to learn how to fight the Germans. The Russians paid catastrophic prices for 18 months to learn. The Americans, the Germans assume, would pay the same price over the same span of time. That assumption was wrong by March 23rd. What happened in those 35 days was not magic. It was machinery, a machinery of learning that had been quietly assembled since 1942. Start with the paper. On June 18, 1942, the War Department issued the first of a series of bulletins called Tactical and Technical Trends. Every 2 weeks, a new issue went out. Reports from attaches, analyses of captured equipment, translations of German manuals, interviews with Allied soldiers, 40 bulletins, over 2,000 pages, all disseminated down to training establishments by the end of 1943. Then came the combat lessons pamphlets. They were not signed by generals. They were short, practical observations from individual soldiers. A sergeant describing how his squad handled a machine gun nest, a tank commander explaining a specific maneuver. 9 issues were published, printed in enormous runs, and distributed down to the company level. The Germans had nothing like this. Their doctrine stated that insight belonged to commanders. The idea of asking a sergeant to explain his tactical innovation, then printing it and sending it to every other sergeant in the army, would have struck a German staff officer as a total inversion of how a professional military worked. Then came the Army Ground Forces Observer Board. Officers specifically sent to ride with combat units, record what worked and what didn't, and fly back to the US to brief replacement training centres at Fort Benning, Fort Sill and Fort Knox. And underneath all of this was the constant quiet layer of the American system, the after-action report. Every American unit, after every engagement, produced one, not filed and forgotten, collected, analysed and excerpted. The cycle time of this machinery was something no other army achieved. A battle happened. Within days, survivors wrote a report. Within weeks, it was read by observers. Within a month, observations were excerpted into a bulletin. Within 6 to 8 weeks, that bulletin reached a training centre in Texas. The curriculum changed, and the next shipment of replacements arrived at the front, carrying the hard-won lessons of the men they were replacing. That was the feedback loop. That was what the Germans could not see. Within 48 hours of Kasserine's conclusion, Eisenhower acted. Fredendall was out. Patton was in. But while Patton handled the command culture, Elagabalus, the doctrinal lessons of Kasserine, were already moving through the machinery at a speed the Germans wouldn't have believed. The 1st Infantry Division, Terry Allen's Big Red One, spent those intervening weeks reviewing every unit level after action report and drilling the corrections. Their artillery re-registered batteries under a centralised fire direction system. Anti-tank guns, which had been placed forward and isolated at Kasserine, were now positioned in depth, tied to mutually supporting minefields. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion drilled gunnery under conditions simulating the exact German armoured attacks that had chewed them up at Sidi Bou Zid. On March 23rd, when von Broech's tanks rolled forward at El Guettar, they did not hit the army they had beaten in February. They hit a minefield that stopped them cold. They faced artillery pre-registered on their approach routes, and when they tried to bypass the mines, they were ambushed by M10s firing from defilade, operated by men who had drilled that exact scenario for 3 weeks. Rommel, reviewing the reports before leaving Africa for good, wrote, "The Americans had fought brilliantly." He noted their tactically more flexible command. He had noticed, without quite being able to name it, that the Americans were operating at a tempo they couldn't achieve 5 weeks prior. He didn't understand why. The Big Red One didn't have better men or better tanks. What had changed was the volume and speed of the information flowing through their system. If Kasserine to El Guettar took 35 days, Normandy would see the same transformation happen in 11. Jump ahead 15 months. June 1944. American divisions slam into a terrain problem nobody planned for, the bocage. For centuries, Norman farmers had enclosed fields with dense, 10-foot-high hedgerows backed by deep earth banks. The Germans moved into this landscape and turned every hedge into a machine gun position, every corner into an anti-tank ambush. American tanks couldn't break through. When they tried to climb the banks, their thin bellies were exposed to German Panzerfausts. Their guns pointed uselessly at the sky. Casualties climbed to rates that alarmed the High Command. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Division, the best-equipped armoured division in the West, expected the Americans to grind through the bocage slowly for weeks. The American solution did not come from a general. It came from a conversation in a cavalry reconnaissance bivouac. A group of tankers were complaining about the hedgerows when, according to surviving records, an enlisted soldier from Tennessee identified only as Roberts made a joke. "Why don't we put saw teeth on the front of the tank and cut straight through?" Most of the men laughed. One didn't. Sergeant Curtis G. Culin, a 29-year-old from New Jersey, went scavenging. He found scrap steel from German beach obstacles, welded 4 tusk-like prongs to the front of a tank, and backed it into a hedgerow. It tore straight through. On July 14th, General Omar Bradley came out to watch. He later wrote that it was so absurdly simple, it had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks. Within hours, the Corps Ordnance Officer was on the radio ordering round-the-clock production. Scrap metal was collected from the beaches. Welding crews worked through the night. The clock started on July 14th. By July 25th, 11 days later, 500 of these devices had been manufactured. 3 out of every 5 American tanks in the First Army were now fitted with what the troops called rhinos. When Operation Cobra launched, Bayerlein's Panzer Division was hit by a massive carpet bombing, and then the American armour moved forward, cutting through the hedgerows that Bayerlein had bet his life would hold. Bayerlein later described his losses as 70% dead, wounded, or crazed, and then he added a sentence that touches the exact nerve of this story. He had been certain the Americans could not break the bocage quickly. Instead, they arrived at his line with a solution he had never seen before, already installed on the majority of their tanks. Incomprehensible. The final question is the one the Germans never answered. Why couldn't they copy the American system? The combat lessons pamphlets were found in captured German intelligence files by 1944. The outlines of the system were known. They still couldn't build it, and the reason had nothing to do with paper or printing. It had to do with 3 things deeper than doctrine. First, whose observation counted. In the German tradition, tactical insight belonged to commanders. It was a virtue of the man, not a product of the system. The idea that a 29-year-old sergeant from New Jersey might be the source of the most important tactical innovation in Normandy was not part of their culture. It was a question of who was permitted to have ideas. Second, what could be honestly reported? American after-action reports could explicitly state that an attack failed due to a specific error, and no one was punished for writing it. By 1944, the German army operated under a political system that treated pessimism as defeatism and defeatism as a capital crime. Honest field reporting had largely dried up, and honest reporting was the fuel that made the American system run. Third, speed. American industrial capacity printed millions of pages. American transport moved an observer from a Belgian foxhole to a classroom at Fort Benning in a week. By 1944, as the German army was losing the ability to move paper across its own borders, the American feedback loop was accelerating. Unit for unit, man for man, German infantry and armour remained formidable into the last weeks of the war. What the Germans lost was the race of adaptation. They built their army around individual genius, carefully cultivated over a career. The Americans built theirs around a system that turned every failure and every sergeant's bright idea into training material for everyone else. Over 3 years, the system beat the genius. Circle back to the morning of March 23, 1943. On the high plateau east of Guettar, Fritz von Broik sits in his command car. His tanks are beginning to burn. He cannot see it yet, but the war is already decided, not by the men in the valley, but by a mechanism he cannot see. A printing press in Washington, a training depot in Texas, a sergeant in a bivouac making a joke about sore teeth, a feedback loop pulling lessons out of the dead and the wounded and pouring them back into the living. Curtis Culin was awarded the Legion of Merit for the Rhino tank. He later lost his left foot to a mine in the Hurtgen forest. He died in 1963, largely unknown outside his hometown. The enlisted man from Tennessee, Roberts, whose joke started it all, disappears from the historical record entirely. The generals have their statues, the privates and the sergeants mostly do not. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button and subscribe. The story of how an army of volunteer citizens built a learning machine that outpaced the professional militaries of Europe is not over. It is still being taught, and it is still being forgotten. War is a system, but the men who fought it were not numbers. They had names. Curtis Culin had a name, Roberts had a name, and Fritz von Broik watched his tanks burn at Guettar because somewhere behind those American lines, a sergeant's observation from a week earlier had already reached the gunner on an M10.